All right. Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is Donald Kimball. I am the communications manager at Washington Policy Center. Thanks so much for joining us this week. This is the last week we're doing these weekly. We're going to go back to our regular every other week schedule because the legislative session has concluded. And so that's going to be a lot of what we're talking about today. An overview of some of the end of session items that happened. And we're going to start by talking with our Center for Government Reform Director, Chris Corry, before we move to our Center for the Environment Director, Todd Myers. So, Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's start with what do the revenue forecasts look like for Washington State? As we've been talking about for a long time, Washington's been in a very positive place. Is that trend continuing?
It is continuing. The legislative session started off with an almost $2 billion surplus over the last projected, start of the biennium forecast. So the trend of continuing growth continues. And mind you that revenue growth does not include the Climate Commitment Act, which is tracked separately and is not part of the revenue forecast. So continued growth, there's much to a lot of people second guessing, there seems to be no sign of it slowing down, even though, we continue hearing that it's, just on the horizon.
Well, and it's interesting that you note that Climate Commitment Act separation because there's so much of the doom and gloom that's talked about with Initiative 2117, which I'm going to talk to Todd about. But that's really interesting. I didn't even realize they were tracked separately. As a reminder, by the way, to anyone attending, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, I believe, where you can ask questions, and we'll get to those towards the end of each segment here. So what were the budget priorities then when it came? Because obviously, if we've got a lot of revenue, that means that we have at least some leeway to spend it, and there are certainly great needs the state has. And was there any consideration of tax relief among those priorities? What did you see?
No real broad-based tax relief. The only area where they did any sort of what we could argue as tax relief is around some eligibility expansion and time changes to the working families tax credit. And as a reminder, the working families tax credit essentially is a rebate that is, based in the statute. It has to be funded by the legislature. Typically targets low-income families, and it's an assumption that, okay, you've paid in estimated X amount of dollars in sales tax. This is a rebate back. It's actually something that's been on the books for a long time, but it wasn't really until the last few years where it was funded by the legislature. That's really the only tax relief, rather than, what we would argue at the Policy Center of broad-based tax relief. We're still we're the outlier state that hasn't provided any of that since the pandemic.
And why do you think that is? Is there any sort of acknowledgement that you hear from people when they're writing the budget about avoiding that, or that they can't afford it? What's the rationale to not provide this tax relief that's been so long awaited from us in Washington State?
So I think that there is a notion that that people don't need tax relief; they need investments, right? That's the language that we hear, and so they are investing in, whether it's childcare, or other pieces, or in the case of, like, let's say, the utility rebates that are coming through the operating budget. There was an acknowledgement this session that, yes, the Climate Commitment Act has drastically increased people's home utility bills. And so there's a $200 rebate that's supposed to be given out before the end of September to those affected communities. So that's really about it. The idea is that, you're going to give your money to the state, and we're going to find a way to give you something in return, is kind of the mantra in Olympia.
So they're a little bit wiser on how to spend your money than you are, is kind of the general message it seems to be sent there.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Well, in more positive news, obviously, 3 of the 6 initiatives that were submitted by Let's Go Washington got hearings, and eventually all 3 of these that did get hearings passed along bipartisan lines. There have been some questions about what is the process for those. They do get enacted into law without the governor's signature in 90 days from the close of session, if I have that correct. Is there a process for them to be amended? And then what would that process look like for the other 3 should they pass this November?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with the other 3 first. If they are voted on by the citizens in November, They will go into law. Again, no governor veto 90 days after certification. Now, in our Constitution, it states that you can't act or amend those for 2 years or with a two-thirds vote. So in order to amend those, it has to wait 2 years or have, obviously a super majority in the legislature vote to amend those. There's been some question and some ambiguity on the ones that just passed by the legislature. What happens there? Because there's no direct mention if it's enacted into law. So, I can't give you an exact answer, but, they've theorized that sure, you could call a one-day special session tomorrow and just repeal all the initiatives you went into law. But again, you got to think about the political nature of what happened here. I think they viewed these as probably the three most popular ones. And so there would be a lot of constituents in their districts that may be unhappy if that happens.
And as a reminder to anyone listening about these initiatives, the three that received hearings were initiatives to enact a local and state income tax ban, to restore police pursuit rights, and to establish a parental Bill of Rights in education. And the three that will be on the ballot this November, barring any act of God, I suppose, would be to repeal the Climate Commitment Act, to repeal the capital gains tax, and to make the Washington Cares long-term care tax a voluntary program. So speaking of the initiative to ban local and state income taxes, that was I-2111, I believe, that seemed to pass on pretty overwhelmingly bipartisan lines. But there were a few objectors and people who voted no. The logic that I heard from some of the speeches was something along the lines of, this initiative doesn't do anything. We don't have any income taxes, so it doesn't do anything. So I'm going to vote against it. And I'm actually sympathetic to that, in that you don't want a bunch of unnecessary, repetitive, bloated laws in your structure. But the way that I read it, Washington's Constitution does allow for an income tax, albeit it would have to be uniform and under 1%. This initiative would ban that now by law. Am I understanding that correctly?
So this would basically say no income tax as defined by the IRS. And you're correct. The state constitution is silent on, it doesn't actually overtly prohibit an income tax. What it does say, to your point, is that it treats income as property. And so you'd have to be a uniform tax. Now, I won't speak to what the legislators were voting on, but some of the arguments we heard were, one, that this was unnecessary, but also, there are proponents of saying we want a progressive income tax in this state, as previously has been discussed by the Washington Policy Center. So probably two different trains of thought there, and maybe why people are voting no.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say another potential workaround for an income tax would be if there was some kind of state, maybe a Supreme Court case that redefined property as not income, setting those separately. Because currently, the precedent, at least in the Supreme Court, is that your property is your income, and that's still true even with the capital gains income tax ruling. Is that fair to say?
The Quinn decision did not change prior court precedent on the long-held view that income is considered property in Washington State.
So it'd be interesting then to say that this initiative into a law does nothing. It may not actively change things, but it certainly does set a new standard, at least in Washington State, at least more clearly. Is that right?
Yeah, and that is what we heard from some of the legislators that spoke on it. And I think it's good clarity. The Washington Policy Center has always advocated for this not only being in state law, but in the state constitution, just to make it abundantly clear where we stand on a personal income tax in this state.
So would this be something where, now that it's in law, it could be adopted into as a constitutional amendment? Are they completely separate processes? Does this make it more likely? What's your read there? And as a reminder, if you have any questions as well for Chris on the budget or anything like that, there is a Q&A panel below.
So my understanding, obviously, it'd be a whole nother process to amend the Constitution that involves not just the legislature, but also a vote of the people. So, having it in state law, I think it's a big step forward for, a place for people across Washington State to point when we're looking at making good public policy.
Yeah, well, and of course, it should at least put some businesses a little bit more relaxed. Of course, the capital gains income tax that does exist as defined as an excise tax should make them a little uneasy, but we'll see how the vote on that initiative happens later this November. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about is recently Governor Inslee had an interview talking about his legacy. and what he wanted it to be in the state. And sort of predictably, he talked about his environmental um, legacy of the laws that he had passed there. That's kind of his pet issue. But he also mentioned, interestingly enough, his response to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the major features of his response to the COVID pandemic was 975 days of emergency authority and emergency powers. Was there any kind of talk that you've heard or that you've witnessed this legislative session that had to do with emergency powers or any kind of check in that capacity?
No, there were, and of course, I'm going to skip on the number, but there was another bill introduced last session for this biennium that would have put some legislative oversight on ongoing emergency powers. Was not given a hearing this year as well. So the trend to ignore government overreach, especially in the executive branch, with no actual check, is still there. And I think one thing that regardless of your party preference, would be something that should be a concern to everyone. There needs to be a check. In every system, there is a check somewhere on power. And I don't believe that an election is a legitimate check, as some have argued that would be.
Now, I think you've probably written a little bit about this in our policy guide. What would be sort of at least a step forward in your view of what a check could look like? I'll put you on the spot here a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And really what you're looking at is in an ongoing emergency, so one that's lasting longer than, I believe the bill set it to 60 days, the governor would come to the legislature to approve, modify, or reject a continued state of emergency. And, the idea of a declaration of a state of emergency is to quickly restore order, to allow for things to happen in the legislature's absence, right? Because we're obviously not all in Olympia all year round. And so 60 days would be enough time to, set the wheels in motion. And then if there's an ongoing problem, that appeal can be made by the governor to the people's representatives for a discussion. Because as we saw with COVID, people were forced to live under some pretty draconian measures, and they had no legitimate recourse to have their voices their concerns addressed or changed or modified. And frankly, from a governing perspective, having shared responsibility for such large projects or issues, I think makes for good public policy.
Interesting. Yeah. I also wanted to touch on a couple of other things. I might surprise you here, so apologies there, but a couple things come to mind. Looking at this legislative session, obviously, since the COVID lockdowns, one of the things that has stayed from that has been a WPC recommendation, has been remote testimony. And I was curious, just in your view of the legislative session, with it having stayed, has this opened up a lot more variety of people and access? Has this been a positive change in the way that we had hoped it would be?
Yeah, so that is actually a wonderful silver lining, and the ability for people not to have to drive over the pass in the middle of winter has been really good. We have seen a lot more people. There's been some antics. We have some interesting characters that show up, but that's their right as Washingtonians. And on the whole, I think it's been very good to be able to hear from people that you traditionally wouldn't hear from, and get perspectives that are unique to working moms and dads who may not have time to spend the day or an overnight trip for 1 minute or 90 seconds in front of a committee. So that ability, I'm glad we were looking to test pilot that in the beginning of 2020, and COVID basically said, no, you're going to get to do the full thing. So yeah. I'm glad we've got a pretty robust system for citizen engagement, and that works to all of our benefits.
Awesome. And the last thing that I'll follow up, and I remember I think it was the last legislative session, there was a bill that passed which would establish a tax transparency website. Is there any movement on that, or are there any other measures that would help sort of these transparent measures for government, for citizens to know how they're being taxed or what they're being taxed on or what taxes are looming or anything like that? Are there any more of these sort of reforms for transparency or any progress on the previous ones being made?
So there was nothing new, but that that original funding is still ongoing. So as they work to develop that, and I imagine this will be a multi-year project to get it from start to finish, just due to the complexities. But it's something that the Policy Center will continue to monitor and watch for.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it. If any of you
My
guys
pleasure.
have any follow-up questions, you can go to our website, and on our staff page, our emails are there, so you can email Chris or any of our other center directors directly for any questions about this ledge session.
Thank you.
Thank you.